Our last big topic for designing corporate communications this time around is the application of communication design to place, nation, and as we'll talk about in a final session, even the European Union, which is a fundamental part of a project that I've been working on for a while, and I'll share with you a little bit in a class context. I want to just focus in this very short presentation on the broader set of issues around public branding stakeholders and the fact that there are some pretty significant differences in branding a place or a nation or a supranational entity larger than a nation in the form of, say, the European Union by comparison with a company. The first thing I simply want to emphasize, and it's so easy to forget because we're so used to the modern nation state and being citizens of nations and a system of nation states, is that very much a significant part of the nation building process was actually about building a brand, a national brand. Imagining that this particular political entity of the state aligned in some sense with a nation, and we understand a nation in a broad sense of some kind of shared common cultural ethne, for example, although so often the modern boundaries of states and nation states actually didn't have a single common nation in a cultural sense there. So precisely for that reason, there need to be this process of building national narratives, national symbols, national identities, and differentiating a particular nation state from another. So we see, of course, that this gets very politically sensitive at home, but sometimes abroad when it crosses into the domain of identity claims by other nation states. So the rise of the mass media in the late 19th century into the 20th century was actually critical to the development of the notion of the modern nation state and citizenry, and particularly shared understandings of what the nation state was. Arguably, without mass literacy and without mass media, we could never have arrived at the whole notion of a national identity as is so familiar to us today. At the same time, of course, in liberal democracies, individual citizens are free to be whatever they want. They're free to be incredibly critical of their government, to be saying explicitly, not in my name, in the name of in the terms of one critical social movement that was quite active from about 15 years ago, saying to their national politicians, don't do things on behalf of citizens, all citizens, when we don't actually disagree with what you want, with what you're doing. So we see there is invariably going to be lots of individual identities, regional identities, city identities, and obviously subcultural, political identities and whatnot within a particular nation state. So to try and brand this national entity or something even bigger than that, such as the European Union, is going to be always quite fraught with contention. So there are really diverse stakeholders, subnational governments, organizationally, you've got tourism bodies that are promoting the destination, for example. You've got trade promotion organizations, a whole range of private sector stakeholders, airlines, for example, because they're so critical on so dependent on inbound tourists, for example, coming as part of their customer base, so they will be literally flying the flag for the destination. So all of those kind of things, all of those contending imperatives, sometimes complementary imperatives, add up to a much more complex set of calculations about branding and communication design than a typical company experiences. Now, sometimes the very identity of the nation state is tied up with a strong founding personality. We see in the case of Turkey, Kemal Atatürk, the whole state ideology of Turkish modernizing nationalism. This is actually in Cyprus, on the Turkish side of the border. Cyprus is divided, and literally Atatürk looms large everywhere in terms of political symbolism around the nation, in that case Cyprus, half of Cyprus occupied by the Turks. So in my country, Australia, was created through a federation of separate colonies which became self-governing states, and so the symbolism there, of course, I've got some animals and flora and fauna and whatnot, and the Federation star up the top to suggest a unification of the states, and each of those separate coats of arms there that in the single coat of arms represent the particular states. Of course, in liberal democracies, we're really free to mess with the symbolism of the nation state. This is from the Sex Pistols, and arguably the punk band did more actually to boost, update, to freshen up the Union Jack British national symbol through its flag than anyone else in the last few decades. And there they are, bashing out some tunes. Okay, so these diverse stakeholders, to more or less a degree, involved in what was very famously described by the scholar Benedict Anderson in a process of imagined communities, of helping to articulate some sense that individuals living in this particular place, subject to a state and bounded by then what become national borders, have something in common as a community. Yet, of course, we have strong separatist nationalist movements who don't agree with that shared vision of an imagined community and imagine smaller independent communities. And I've identified various stakeholders there already previously in the slides. There are a whole lot of practical impacts in this. Everybody wants their interests considered. Everyone wants their bit included in, for example, national branding or promotional endeavours. And as a consequence, there's a great danger of mission overload. That there will be a lack of a strategic coherence in trying to project a particular place, nation, brand, regional brand, for example. So very strong interdependence between nation and region brands and corporate brands. The airlines, as I mentioned, the Air France example, and you've got links to that in Moodle, you can see that. So we've talked about the national carriers in the past as literally flagship carriers. The flagship airlines or just national carriers. Historically, they were owned by government, then they were privatized, but we still see that leading airlines, even if they're private businesses just like anything else, still have this very strong identity as the kind of the champion, one of the champions of a national brand. So we see that governments have long engaged in public diplomacy to try and influence the citizens of other countries, to in turn influence their national governments, to increase national influence. This notion of soft power, for example, captures this, the idea that rather than just simply threatening people in other nations to try and cooperate with with your national goals, much better that they actually like you because of your culture or your political values or whatever, and that they actually want to align with you, they want to cooperate with you. So there's always these difficult questions of who do you actually target in political diplomacy, public diplomacy, and particularly cultural diplomacy. Do you just target the elites who might be directly influential over government, or do you try and speak to larger populations? And so there's some very interesting tactical questions in terms of, say, the role of digital diplomacy. And digital diplomacy arguably can efficiently speak to wide-ranging audiences, typical event-based activities, inviting people to a select event, for example, where they get to meet the ambassador and or visiting politicians or whatever. Obviously, that's more elite kind of centered, but that's been a traditional way that a lot of cultural diplomacy has worked, for instance. Now, I just want to say that cultural diplomacy really can work, and very often as cultural diplomacy, it can actually be led by the private sector. I just want to focus briefly on this. This was an initiative done by Idemitsu Korsan, the very famous Idemitsu in terms of being a petroleum company, but they also trade other minerals and whatnot. They were significant investors in Australia. And when there was some controversy about Japanese investment back in the late 1980s in Australia, and there's a bit of people revisiting wartime memory and politically a little bit contentious. Idemitsu Korsan, which has the founder of the company, also founded the Idemitsu Museum, and they have a great collection of these works by this fascinating Buddhist artist of the past, Sengai. They brought a touring exhibition to Australia, and I went to see it as a young university student. It had a huge positive impact on me. I have that book, I have a poster as well. And not only myself, I have a good friend who's a professor of architecture at the University of Tasmania. He came to my apartment in Niigata, walked in, and was amazed to see the poster from the Sengai exhibition. He said, I went to that exhibition when it came to Adelaide, and it was a huge factor in making me interested in Japan. So both of us, long-standing engagement with Japan. In fact, he used to teach architecture at Waseda as well. Were in no small part prompted to engage deeply with Japan because, as university students, we saw this cultural, this art exhibition, which had been sponsored by a Japanese petrochemical company. And we see some other interesting initiatives. After World War II, the building of the International House in Japan, which is in Roppongi, and you can go there, and it's a beautiful modernist building. Some very famous architects, Maekao Kunio and Sakakura Junzo, for example, were involved in the design of it. This has been a major center for cultural collaboration. Oh, there's a small typo there. It should be Yoshimura Junzo as well. There's an O missing from the end there. Very interesting place, a major site for cultural collaborations between particularly the United States and Europe, but particularly the United States and Japan after World War II. Indeed, a significant source of the funding, as I say in the notes here, actually came from the Rockefeller Foundation. So a really important thing is that nation branding has to be kind of subtle. You can't be too hectoring. The Chinese government has become very active with its Confucius institutes and whatnot. I mean, giving large statues of Confucius away in various places. I must say sometimes they're kind of parked off in the back of gardens. There is a substantial one in Waseda in the Okuma garden. You can go and seek out Confucius if you want there. Okay. At the same time, nation branding won't necessarily counterweight political contention. And we see particularly in the Chinese context, for example, the artist Ai Weiwei won international awards and at some points was restricted from traveling abroad. And so those kind of political contentions are happening at the same time that China was proactively trying to, through cultural diplomacy, promote its national image abroad. So there's very diverse nation and place branding resources, and a lot of it the government has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with. This is right near where I live. I live between Yotsuya Sanchome, Yotsuya, and Shinonamachi, and right near this staircase, and this is Kimi-no-Nawa, so your name in this staircase, and until COVID, huge numbers of tourists would come on and reenact this scene by the staircase, and I was always have to say, just excuse me, I've got to get to work, right? I would have to go down this staircase to get to the subway. So this anime has had a huge influence in drawing tourists to Tokyo. By the way, you can see Roppongi Hills in the background. It's not actually there. That's completely in the opposite direction. Shinkai Makoto always seems to stick that in there for some reason or another. Sometimes Japanese abroad become a major source of influence. Daiki Suzuki, a very influential fashion designer based in New York with engineered garments, took American-style workwear, gave it a very distinctive Japanese sensibility, based out of New York, hugely influential in Japan, but also abroad as well. I just want to emphasize too, architecture. Not a lot of people pay attention to this because Japanese architects just get on and do their thing. We tend to be focused on the manga and anime as a source of Japanese cultural influence abroad. But Japanese architects have outsized influence, and I've listed just to name them. Some names there, but there are many more. Japanese architects that are winning large projects abroad and also then having major exhibitions about their work in places like MoMA and whatnot. But just more generally, I want to emphasize that there's whole ecologies of brands that have been built up over many, many decades, and sometimes it can be simple consumer goods, such as Pernod, a drink from France, indelibly associated with images of southern France, particularly in summer, and whatnot. So these complex, positively mutually reinforcing ecologies of private and regional and national brands are not something that can be just conjured up by design, but by design can be very effectively projected, refreshed, revitalized to achieve cultural diplomacy ends. Also want to emphasize just simply having very strong cultural and creative industries, for example, can significantly boost your brand. Denmark is a very good example of this. Here's me in front of Denmark. Okay. Great mid-century furniture designers such as Hans Werner, for example, Louis Poulsen and Poul Henningsen, the famous light designs and whatnot, immediately recognizable. Much more recently, René Redzepi won the World's Best Restaurant Awards several times with Noma, and we see the boom in new Nordic cuisine. All of this really adds up to a refreshing of the Danish brand repeatedly. No one here motivated per se to project Danishness or Danish influence in the world. They're doing their thing, but they get a lot of respect for it, and then it boosts the national brand. We then see, of course, that René Redzepi figures on the official website of Denmark at the top page. Okay, so the state is often very quick to harness its creatives effectively. But then influence can stretch in funny ways too. Jonutsen, the designer of the Sydney Opera House, one of the most recognizable symbols of any place anywhere in the world. You only need to draw the outline of the Opera House to evoke not just Sydney but Australia, done by a Danish architect. Okay. I've got some links on Moodle. Interesting questions of where do we get our images of nations from campaigns, or in return do the campaigns tap national images? Do they reinforce existing cliches? I have my doubts about whether Australia does it as well as they could. I'm quite convinced they haven't actually. The New Zealanders have been much more impressive by comparison. So interesting questions then about particular perceptions of brand personality. And just simply want to say that the Japanese context, if you take a critical political perspective, you might think in terms of ongoing issues of war memory and whatnot, and maybe this is an image still out of South Korea and China, and we see political protests that might around Yasukuni, and this is always the 15th of August every year. The foreign media are always there at Yasukuni, and then the left and the right are having a bit of protest, and there's a very strong kind of performative dimension. And poor Abe-san now, the tragedy of his killing. But he was in some respects politically a polarizing figure, although he had outsized influence in the world at large and has been remembered very, very positively. But all of this kind of adds up actually to a good image of Japanese democracy, that you actually can have these kind of protests. The final thing to observe, and this is an old data, but it's interesting data, because this was the last time that Future Brand, which was one of the most influential nation brand rankings, did their exercise, and actually Japan came in number one. In no small part after the disaster, the triple disaster of 2011. So, and we see that Japan figured there for a range of reasons, and you can dive into that, but very strong emphasis on Japan being strong in technology, strong in terms of heritage and culture, its uniqueness, good business environment, and whatnot. So you can look through the details of the slides there. What we see is strong interrelationship between Japanese corporate brands, powerful corporate brands, and the Japanese national brand. They tend to reinforce each other. One of the interesting things in this particular case is that several of the brands there actually were sort of struggling with scandals and whatnot at the time when these surveys were done. And Future Brand typically surveyed cosmopolitan mobile professionals who traveled a lot. So they were very much focused on the kind of people who would be working for international companies, who might be making decisions about investment, might be choosing where to go on international holidays, for example, and whatnot. So overall, Japan's image in terms of technology was very strong, and a sense of uniqueness and cultural significance very strong. But the question of uniqueness and strong tradition and distinctiveness, it's a double-edged sword. It's very attractive as a tourism destination, but it's perhaps less attractive as a destination for someone to come and migrate to live long term, for example, as a professional sojourner. So you'll see, for example, a place like Australia, where I'm from, it doesn't get a lot of recognition in terms of culture, I'm afraid to say, but it gets very high recognition in terms of its cultural diversity, in a sense of its openness to migrants and its migrant heritage, and the quality of the lifestyle in the Australian context, which means it's very attractive as a destination for companies looking to build a corporate base there and have some of their executives based there. It's very attractive to potential migrants, rather less attractive to tourists who are looking for a very rich cultural experience. Of course, you can draw some people to the resorts and whatnot, but there are plenty of other places that have beautiful resorts as well too. So when we go back to the Japanese case and think about issues of perceptions of Japan, there are some very positive messages out there. There's some very negative images in a subset of countries, some of the closest ones around war issues, but even then, very strong respect for elements of, say, Japanese culture and technology. And in the past, in face-to-face classes, you can see some pictures here, we've done this simple exercise where we just ask students to brainstorm adjectives that they associated with images of Japan. And so some of them very positive, some of them more negative. One of the interesting things is when you ask people to say, for example, pick 5 words, they had more latitude to come up with some negative attitudes as well. If you ask people to pick just 3 adjectives, they overwhelmingly just picked positive ones. So there's some really interesting methodological questions. How do you actually ask people about what their perceptions are? Now, you've got a separate small set of slides which shows some of the words that people have come up with doing this exercise in previous years. So I suggest you maybe zoom in and just have a little bit of a look at that. And if you ask me to pick one word which might best capture Japan's brand personality, I would say quirky. Quirky in the sense of Japan being very distinctive, sometimes a bit kwateru, doktoku, a bit eccentric at times, but generally quite endearing, distinctive, very interesting. And this actually works enormously as a brand resource. What it means is if you're offering a service, for example, and it is not Global Kijun, if it's not exactly delivered in a way that people are kind of accustomed to, if they think in a positive kind of way that Japan's a bit quirky, it's a very distinctive place, it's so Japanese, then actually you've got a lot of latitude to get things a bit wrong. People will be sort of forgiving precisely because of your slight eccentricity or distinctiveness. And it's often argued by people who observe how Japan is observed internationally, is that they say that Japan starts with so many cultural resources and there's so much goodwill in the world at large towards Japan that Japan has a lot of leeway, a lot of latitude to not get things as right as they could do, and for people to be forgiving. And very often, I think audiences instinctively value things that come out of Japan very highly because of Japan's association with quality, refinement, artisanship, and whatnot. So, insofar as a product or a service or experience might quite not meet foreign customers' needs, they're more likely to put it down to just simply differences of values or approach, or maybe themselves. They might even fault themselves for not getting it, okay, rather than faulting the product or the service out of Japan. Anyway, have a look at some of those other slides where you can see what some of your senpai in this class in previous years have come up with, and have a think about whether there are other adjectives that come to mind in relation to your perceptions of Japan. So, thank you.